Director Joe Carnahan's very first movie was filmed in my hometown, so it's always kind of cool to see a semi-local put out new content. This time he's repartnered with Frank Grillo for his action thriller Copshop that also stars Gerard Butler. It's hitting theaters this weekend, so should you get some tickets? On the run from a lethal assassin, a wily con artist devises a scheme to hide out inside a small-town police station. But when the hitman turns up at the precinct, an unsuspecting cop finds herself caught in the crosshairs. So we've got Frank Grillo, who's really looking like Mickey Rourke in this film, and he's playing this sketchy guy named Teddy. Teddy gets himself arrested in the hopes of having some safety and then protection by being inside the police station. Gerard Butler plays Bob, who's out to get Teddy, and they get to have some interesting dialogue exchanges in this movie. Now, Joe Carnahan has made some decent action thrillers, like Smokin' Aces, The A-Team, The Grey, and Narc. Now, I've also heard good things about Boss Level, which also stars Frank Grillo, but I've not seen that one. The point is, the director knows how to do action, and a lot of the time, it's a fun and engaging time as well. In Copshop, the story is thin, like almost transparently thin. Teddy's on the run. From who? Some bad people who want bad things to happen to him. And there's money also that's involved, but apparently the motives just aren't terribly important. Bob's motivation is purely job-oriented. Teddy's the mark and his task is to get him. Alright, simple enough. Then we have all of the police officers, now who should provide a lot of difficulties for any of the bad guys, but this station seems to be filled with ineptitude, with the exception of Alexis Louder as Officer Young. She's fairly charismatic and likable, so it's kinda easy to connect with her, and I think she's also really the star of this story, even though she's not top billed. There's also another character named Tony, who I enjoyed simply because he's just a bit bonkers. He's fairly unhinged, and the psychopathic insanity comes across as understated, but then convincing. So the story is, we've got one bad guy, and there are apparently a lot of other bad guys after him. Now, I say a lot, but really we can only see one other who comes after Teddy. And it's a race to get him, and I think that it's more of a case of wanted dead rather than wanted dead or alive. I'd like to say that the one thing this film does well is the action, but that's not the case. I mean, the action is just okay. Now, there is a lot of violence, but the sequences are just several people walking around shooting up the place, and they miss each other a lot of the time. There's also not much fight choreography or even decent cloak and dagger when it comes to the chase sequences within the station. There is one tense scene that I felt was done really well because it involves a high anxiety situation where a character has to keep their cool under the most extreme of circumstances in order to complete a time-sensitive task. For me, this was probably the best scene in the entire movie. I felt pressure and urgency for the character and then became concerned for their outcome. Everything else in this is kind of boring, which is unfortunate. The dialogue exchanges between Teddy, Bob, and Officer Young, they had the potential to be weighty and tense, but because the story didn't have any development to it, what they said were just words without consequences. The film assumed that I'd be invested in the characters enough to care about what happens to them, but I just didn't, and that's all because I don't really know any of them. And some of that comes from not really understanding the impetus for the pursuit of Teddy. I mean, I understand that the bad guys want him because he has a lot of information on them, and then he even has some maybe of their money, but it's not interesting enough to compel my concern. Now, I liked the contained setting of the police station. It's large enough to provide some movement, but also small enough to restrict that movement. And there's a good portion of the story that takes place within the holding cells, and I think this would have been the perfect opportunity for some claustrophobic tension, but that was never achieved. All urgency and restrictedness somehow just fizzled, and it never came to fruition once the scene moves to this area. It felt like wasted potential here. I mean, when you put several of the main players in a tight and contained space with only one way in or out, that's the setting for high anxiety. Pressure can be applied to the characters to reach some sort of breaking point, but that just didn't exist. Instead, there's an immense lack of pressure, making these scenes more boring than anything. The dialogue in this scene was meant to be tense too, but because there weren't any external forces creating suspense, what they were saying just felt inconsequential. There's a side story that is extremely underdeveloped as well. So much so that it's almost just a distraction because nothing of consequence is added from the inclusion. Now, it does come around to connect to the main story, but everyone that is involved in that side story is a complete stranger with zero explanation of their purpose. If I think back to Carnahan's Smokin' Aces, the story is fairly similar to Copshop, at least in the premise where we have a character that people are after and chaos and destruction are unleashed in that pursuit. But in Aces, at least we understood exactly why everybody was after Buddy Israel. the story was fleshed out, and the motivations were well developed. In Copshop, the audience is just expected to buy into the thin story and be entranced by the sporadic action. Now, some of the choreography does work in this, but there are also some inconsistent shooting styles that are inserted that just feel odd, almost like they were reshoots or afterthoughts. And these were more distracting than complimentary. This is an hour and 48 minutes of almost arduous watching. When the guns are firing, it breaks up the monotony, but it's still not that exciting. And something that bugged me was that there were a couple of huge continuity errors, all of them involving the guns and ammunition. We see a submachine gun with 2 clips connected together so that when one runs out, it can just be ejected, flipped upside down, and right back in, loaded quickly, and then you're good to go. The problem is that the exposed clip is shown to be empty, and then when somebody's firing the gun and they run out of ammo, they flip the clip and then they just keep firing. What? This may seem minor, but when it's exposed so blatantly like that, it just became bothersome. And then there's the ending. It takes on a completely different look and feel than the rest of the movie, and then is ultimately pointless and even more unrealistic than what had preceded it. Now, if this were playing on a streaming service that you didn't have to pay extra to see it, it may be good to put on as a casual watch when you have nothing better to do, but I really do have a hard time recommending that you see this in the theater. The story is lacking in development and depth, with a premise that is just paper thin. It's like this is built on a concept that nobody ever decided to fill out. The characters are flimsily crafted, and even though they do have a little bit of charisma, it's not enough to suck you into the narrative. And even the action is lackluster. While there is some unflinching violence, without the support of a good story to pair it with, it's just violence for violence's sake, and that's not entertaining. I think if you want to see a Joe Carnahan movie with some wonderful shootouts, crazy violence, and a good story, check out Smokin' Aces. If you want a decent drama from him, then take a look at The Grey or Narc. There's no sex or nudity, but a ton of profanity and violence. I give Copshop 1.5 out of 5 couches. So what are you watching this weekend? I'd love to know what you plan to check out in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.